Well, good evening. I'm going to share this evening from the book of Ruth, which is an Old Testament book. And the title of tonight's message is BOAZ the Redeemer. BOAZ the Redeemer. Well, the book of Ruth tells the story of a family who lived around 3,000 years ago. And the story begins in a small town called Bethlehem, where a man called Elimelech lives with his wife Naomi and their two sons. And Bethlehem in Hebrew means the house of bread, the house of bread. But there's an irony here, because in Bethlehem, in the house of bread at this time, there is a severe famine. And Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their two sons decide to leave Bethlehem and head for the land of Moab. I'm going to show you a map here of the region, as it may have looked at the time, and you can see Jerusalem there in the kingdom of Judah, and Bethlehem is just south of Jerusalem, and you can see the kingdom there of Moab on the right hand side. And if you remember, there's a man called Lot who is in the city of Sodom with his wife and their daughters, and they are warned that there's an impending doom about to happen in Sodom, and they are advised to leave and told not to look back. And they leave, but Lot's wife disobeys, and she looks back, and she's turned to a pillar of salt. And then Lot's daughters settle with the father, but there are no men around, and they realize that the human race is going to die out, become extinct, or there are certainly no men in the area. So they trap their father and they commit incest, and both of the daughters fall pregnant, and the elder daughter falls pregnant with a man who was born named Moab, and it's the younger daughter who falls pregnant with a man they name Ammon. So Ammon and Moab, and those are the two kingdoms. And you remember the Ammonites being described as enemies of Israel, and they many times engage in battle with the Israelites in the Old Testament. So today this territory is where Jordan is situated on the map. Anyway, Elimelech and his family, they settle in this land of Moab, and their two sons take Moabite wives. The names of the wives are Ruth. This is the title of the book, after whom the book is named, Ruth. And the other wife is called Orpah, the other Moabite woman. But then over a period of 10 years, all three of the men, Elimelech and the two sons, they die, and there are no children. And according to the customs and the attitudes of the day, Ruth and Orpah and their mother-in-law Naomi are facing a massive social disaster, because their family line is going to go extinct. There are no men and there are no more children, so that's it. Their family line will go extinct, will die, and this is a massive social disaster at that time in that society. And then they hear news that the famine in Bethlehem is over, and they decide to return to Bethlehem and to head back. And all three women set off on the journey together. But partway through, Naomi has a change of heart, and she urges Orpah and Ruth to leave her and return back to Moab, return back to their own country, and go back to their mother's houses. I'll read to you from chapter 1 and verse 6 and following. Let me share the screen here. Then she, that's Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So the famine in Bethlehem was over. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, and each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return to you, to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands?" In other words, can I give birth to more sons who you would be able to marry and have your own children? No, turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, will you wait till they are fully grown? Are you going to wait 18 years or whatever until those sons are old enough to become your husbands? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said to Naomi, "Do not urge me to leave you, or to return from following you. For where you will go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And then Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, and she said no more. So Ruth makes this decision to stick with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and to go back to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem as a foreigner in that land. Now, under English law, when my wife and I both pass away, our goods, our flat, our money, what we own will become the property of our son. Of course, unless we write a will to the contrary, but it will become the property of our son. It will pass to our son. Our estate will pass to our son, John, and everything we have will belong to him. And there was a similar kind of law in Israel at that time. But there was an additional qualification, if you like, to that, which was that according to the law and the customs of the day at that time, if a man died without a male heir, his widow was allowed to marry a close relative. And if the marriage then produced a son, the son was considered to belong to the man who had passed away. And that son could then inherit that dead man's estate. So in other words, if Ruth could find a husband and produce a son, then that son would inherit Elimelech's estate, because Elimelech just had those 2 sons and they were both gone. And this was a practice that was actually encouraged. It was called levirate marriage, where you would find a husband. It could be maybe one of the brothers of your deceased husband and marry that brother and then give birth to a child. And then the child will be considered to be the child of the dead man. And this process was known as redemption. So if Ruth could find a close relative of her deceased husband to produce a son, the estate could be redeemed. Anyway, when Ruth and Naomi reached Bethlehem, she's shown kindness by a man called Boaz. Boaz has heard about Ruth's loyalty to her mother-in-law, Naomi. He's an older man, and he's attracted to Ruth, who's still a relatively young woman at that time. And Ruth asks to glean in Boaz's field, and Boaz shows her kindness by allowing her to collect the sheaves of corn, and even commands that some should be deliberately kind of dropped. Don't collect them too tightly. Allow Ruth to glean and to be able to gather some food for herself. And Naomi recognizes that this man Boaz is one of Elimelech's relatives. So maybe Boaz could be Ruth's redeemer. Maybe he could rescue this family situation. Well, Naomi encourages Ruth to offer herself in marriage to Boaz. But there's an obstacle they have to overcome first, because there's actually an even closer relative to Ruth, who is living in Bethlehem at that time, who would kind of have first rights over Ruth, to marry Ruth and become her husband. So Boaz has to speak to this man and ask him to renounce his right to marry Ruth, which he does in the customary way, which at that time was to remove the shoe and hand it to Boaz. So this man removes his shoe and hands it to Boaz as a sign that he's giving up the right to marry Ruth. And then in chapter 4, if I can share this slide again, it says this. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born of Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And we know who David is. David is the king of Israel. He's the boy shepherd who slays Goliath. He's the man who goes on as king to conquer Jerusalem for the nation of Israel. He's the king of a united Israel. And it's actually Ruth, faithful Ruth, who is his great grandmother, not an Israelite, a foreigner living in the land. And Jesus himself is of the house and line of David. He's born in this little town of Bethlehem when Joseph returns to his ancestral home for the census. Do you remember in the gospel we read about that Joseph returns to his ancestral home of Bethlehem, where Mary gives birth to the baby Jesus. So that's a connection with Bethlehem. So what does this story have to speak to us? What does it have to say? Well, I think it says something important about human relationship, that Orpah kisses Naomi goodbye and goes back to her people, or goes back to her gods. But it's Ruth who remains faithful. Ruth actually clings to Naomi. This is the phrase that's used. Ruth clings to her, and she chooses Naomi. She chooses Yahweh, the true God. She chooses to leave behind her foreign gods in the land of Moab and follow her mother-in-law and settle in Bethlehem. And this is about God's grace as well. I mean, Ruth could not have seen the full extent of God's plan here. I mean, she didn't live to see King David born. Great-grandmother would have passed away by then. So she didn't really know her own role in that whole salvation story. She was just faithful in that little part, in that role that she was given, not really able to see the full picture and where that would lead. And that can be the same for us too. We just need to be faithful in what we do. Sometimes we can speak to people about Jesus, we can sow seed. We won't necessarily see that come to fruition in our own lifetime, or that person may go back to another country or whatever. We may not see whatever we do actually bearing fruit within our lifetime, but that doesn't matter. God is calling us to be faithful in what he's calling us to do and asking us to do now. We won't always see the impact as we serve, as we touch people's lives. Maybe that impact will not always be immediately visible to us, but God is working in it, and he's working his plans and purposes through it, just as he did with Ruth. And this man, Boaz, as the Redeemer, well, actually, he is a picture of Jesus. He's a type of Jesus. I've spoken about this before, that these people in the Old Testament who we encounter picture or foreshadow Jesus in some kind of way. In what ways does this man Boaz foreshadow Jesus? Well, he's a godly man. He's full of grace. He allows Ruth to glean from his land. He allows the grain to purposely fall so that she can gather it. He offers Ruth bread to eat, and he offers her drink as well. It's kind of reminiscent of maybe Jesus with that Samaritan woman at the well, offering or asking for a drink. That conversation they have around the well about the living water. Jesus with a foreigner, a Samaritan woman, Boaz with Ruth. And he offers Ruth protection as well. He takes Ruth under his wing. He tells the other men not to harass her or touch her. And he seeks out this closer relative who has a right to Ruth. And if you like, he kind of buys her back in the same way that Jesus buys us back and redeems us. He redeems Ruth, and he redeems the estate and the inheritance. So God can use us too in all kinds of ways that we don't necessarily see and know and understand at the time. But God is working his plan and purpose through us, just in the same way that he did through Ruth. So I'd urge you maybe just to read again through this story. It's just 4 chapters. It's not very long. You can sit down and maybe read the whole book of Ruth in just one reading. And short 4-chapter book, the book of Ruth, but much to be gained, much to be learnt, and many lessons we can take on board for our own lives as well. Okay, thank you, Pastor Peter.